Shalom. I'm Tom Averna. Welcome to podcast number 5 of It Takes a Village to Bring Mashiach. We began with a visit to the future and my dream of what it might look like. We then introduced the idea of the importance of community on both Judaism and Christianity, followed by 2 podcasts introducing the Noahide movement, as well as a brief look at Messianic Christianity. Now, if you missed any of these, you can still listen. I hope I'm laying some important foundations. Today, we're going to take a journey through time again, a journey through thousands of years of human dreaming. We're going to explore one of the most persistent questions that has haunted humanity since the very beginning of time, after we lost the garden. What would a perfect world look like? So think about it for a moment. Have you ever imagined a world without war, a world where everyone has enough to eat, a world where people treat each other with kindness and respect? If you have, you're not alone. You're part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years across every culture and civilization on Earth. This longing for something better, this dream of paradise. It's what we call utopian thinking. And here's what's fascinating. Even though utopian experiments have failed again and again throughout history, humans keep dreaming. We keep imagining. We keep trying to build that perfect society. Why? What is it about us that refuses to give up on this dream? That's what we're going to explore today. We're going to look at how different thinkers, writers, religious traditions have imagined the perfect world. We'll see how these ideas have shaped history, influenced revolutions, and continue to affect how we think about our future today. But we're also going to ask some harder questions. Is the dream of utopia dangerous? Can the pursuit of perfection lead to terrible consequences? Are we tempting the definition of insanity by wanting to believe in this idea? And what does this persistent longing tell us about human nature itself? So there's a lot to cover, and we may again, and most likely will, make this a 2-parter. But I want you to get as complete a picture as possible of this idea, because it really is the foundation of all our hopes for a messianic age. My goal is that you might come away from these podcasts with a clear understanding of why we dream of such perfection and why it's possible to make it real. Let's begin our journey in ancient Greece, shall we? Over 2,000 years ago. Our story really begins there with a man named Plato. Well, actually begins before him, but the main thrust of Utopia begins with Plato, who lived in Athens, Greece, around 380 BCE. Plato, as most of you probably know, was a philosopher, someone who spent his life thinking deeply about truth, justice, and the good life. He'd watched his beloved city of Athens lose a devastating war. He'd seen his teacher Socrates executed by the Athenian government, and he'd become convinced that something was deeply wrong with how societies were organized. So Plato did what philosophers do. He imagined something better. He wrote a book called The Republic, which describes his vision of a perfect city-state. The book would influence Western thinking about ideal societies for the next 2,000 years. In Plato's ideal society, it would be divided into 3 classes, like 3 parts of a single body working together. First, there would be the guardians, the philosopher kings who would rule with wisdom. These weren't ordinary politicians hungry for power. They were people who had spent decades studying philosophy, mathematics, and truth itself. They understood reality at the deepest level, and they would rule not for their own benefit, but for the good of everyone. Second, there would be the auxiliaries. These would be the warriors and defenders of the city. These brave men and women would protect society from external threats and maintain order within. They would be trained from childhood in courage, discipline, and loyalty to the common good. Third, there would be the producers, the farmers, craftsmen, merchants, workers who would provide for everyone's material needs. They would pursue their trades and raise their families, trusting the guardians to make wise decisions for the whole society. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute. This sounds pretty rigid. What if someone in the producer class wants to be a guardian? What about freedom and individual choice? And you'd be asking the right questions. We'll come back to these concerns later. To understand why Plato thought philosopher king should rule, we need to understand one of his most famous teachings, the allegory of the cave. Imagine, Plato said, a group of people who've lived their entire lives chained in a dark room. They face a wall, and behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, who've never seen anything else, believe these shadows are reality itself. Now, imagine one prisoner breaks free. He turns around and sees the fire, painful and bright. He's confused and wants to return to the familiar shadows, but he's dragged up and out of the cave into the sunlight. At first, the sun blinds him, but gradually his eyes adjust. He sees trees and mountains and the sky, the real world in all its beauty and complexity. He understands that the shadows were just illusions. This freed prisoner, Plato said, is like the philosopher. Most people live in the cave of ignorance, mistaking appearances for reality. But the philosopher has climbed out into the light of truth. And once you've seen the truth, Plato argued, you have a responsibility now to go back into the cave and help free the others, even if they resist, even if they don't want to be freed. This is why Plato believed philosophers should rule. They had seen reality clearly. They understood justice, goodness, truth, not as opinions, but as eternal realities. They could organize society according to these eternal truths rather than according to the shifting opinions and the desires of the masses. But Plato's perfect city came with costs. The guardians couldn't own private property or have traditional families. Children would be raised communally, not knowing their biological parents. The city would carefully control education, art, even music, anything that might corrupt the citizens or lead them away from virtue. Plato was willing to sacrifice individual freedom for the sake of justice and harmony. He believed that true happiness came not from doing whatever you wanted, but from fulfilling your proper role in a well-ordered society. Now, this, of course, raises a question that will echo through all of utopian thinking. How much freedom are we willing to give up for the sake of the common good? Can a society be both perfect and free? But even though this is our most well-known version of utopia, it was not the first, and Plato probably drew his inspiration from earlier visions, like those of the Greek Hesiod in the 8th century, or Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE. And before them all, there was another visionary, Moses. Hesiod gave us the story of the golden age of Cronus at the beginning of time. It probably will sound familiar to you. There was no sorrow there, no toil and grief. Age was not a journey to weakness, but a joyous celebration of life without physical deterioration or evil, filled with all that is good. Food was in abundance and came freely from the earth without effort. They and all creatures lived in peace, beloved of their gods. This was the golden age. Interestingly, if you've seen or are interested in these kinds of shows, there is a new series out, second year of the series, called the son of Poseidon. I can't think of the name of the show, but anyway, if you know it, you've seen it. If you've seen it, you know it. But this person is fighting against the desire to bring back Cronus, to bring back this golden age, and this is exactly what they're talking about. This is where we get the information about that from Hesiod. All right. At any rate, Pythagoras is the next one we want to look at, and yes, It is the same Pythagoras who most high school students curse. He was actually a great guy. He may be the second person in history to form a successful spiritual community, and we'll talk about the first soon. So Pythagoras followed up his teachings by not only talking about utopia, but forming it. He created communities that would inspire, I believe, Plato in his writings. There's no definite proof, but there are historical mentions of Pythagoras learning from Jewish teachers, and his ideas are seen in the writings of Philo and Josephus. There's a midrashic source that suggests that the prophet Jeremiah was the teacher to Zoroaster in Persia. So if we really stretch our imaginations, it doesn't actually take a lot of stretch. We can make Jeremiah or his student Baruch as a teacher to Pythagoras. They both lived about the same time. At any rate, many of the Pythagorean beliefs connect to mystical Jewish beliefs. So we have little or no direct information about these communities, as they were famously very secretive, seeming to prefer oral teachings to written ones. This might also sound familiar to you. Here's what we think we know. The communities had two levels, unlike Plato's three-tiered system. The upper level was essentially called the learners, and they lived communally, while the lower level were the listeners who lived in their own homes. The inner circle held all things in common. Their beliefs sound very much like those of a Kabbalist: reincarnation, including into animals, belief in the power of numbers to reveal the secrets of the universe, that all creation sang, and that purity of body and mindful meditation opened the doors to all mysteries. Daily life included periods of silence, communal meals, and learning. Vegetarian diet, and this is interesting, excluding beans. Apparently flatulence did not lend itself to ritual purity. My favorite is that they started each day with exercise and memory training. Imagine a school that did the same thing. They believed also that music and poetry were essential elements in a spiritual life. King David would be proud. For those of you who think all socialists are liberal extremists, by the way, the Pythagorean community tended to be aristocratic and conservative politically, and they had a great deal of influence for their time, so that they existed involved in Greek politics. But it's unlikely they could be labeled democratic, as the power and influence of their leader was considerable. Like prophets of old and many later rebbes, the stories about him tend to be miraculous. He could be in many places at once. He could talk to animals. He remembered all his previous incarnations. He could prophesy about political events, wars, the future, people's lives, and predict earthquakes and storms. And yes, he was a Greek after all. There were stories of his being divine, the son of Apollo, born of a virgin. And he also traveled to hell as a teacher and returned. Again, a story you might be familiar with. But before all of the Greeks, before Pythagoras, before Hesiod, certainly before Plato, there was Moses. While Greek philosophers were imagining ideal cities, another tradition was developing in the ancient Near East, one that would profoundly shape Western civilization's understanding of paradise and perfection. This was the Jewish tradition, rooted in the Hebrew Bible. The Bible begins with a utopian vision, the Garden of Eden. In this perfect place, humans lived in harmony with God, with each other, with nature. There was no death, no suffering, no conflict. Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the evening. They had meaningful work to do, tending the garden, but no backbreaking labor. They had freedom, but also clear boundaries. Everything they needed was provided. This wasn't just an ancient story. It was a vision of how things were meant to be, a template of perfection against which all human history could and would be measured. When things went wrong, when humans chose disobedience and were expelled from the garden, the memory of Eden remained. It became the standard by which people judged their present circumstances and imagined their future hope. We believe Moses was the author of the story of Gan Eden, the garden, and we can be fairly certain this was based on a longer version, which in part can be found in the oral midrashic stories. But even if we take his accepted date based on rabbinic calculations around 1400 BCE, this becomes a far older story than any of the Greeks we mentioned. And like Pythagoras, Moses put his beliefs into practice. We often overlook what could be considered the earliest known utopian community. Think about this. Think about this. It began during the 40 years in the desert, and then for some 300 years later in Israel. Like Plato, the Israelites had three classes. This is amazing. If you just put this together in your mind. The three classes were the Levites, led by Moses. They could be considered the guardians. Today, they're called the rabbis, or the rebbes at any rate. They had a group chosen for military service who would be the auxiliaries. Remember, they numbered their male adults for military service. So there was that division that was there. They had a group chosen for doing just that. They would be the auxiliaries, and everyone else became the producers, holding various roles in building and providing for the community. Interestingly, if you look at the description of the 12 tribes and their blessings, you'll often see the production roles assigned to each of the tribes. Like Plato, the guardians owned no property, but they did raise and value their own children. We'll later see the kibbutzim try this idea of communal raising of children. They fairly quickly gave it up. The other obvious difference that the humanitarian Plato would not have adopted was the overall rulership by God. Interestingly, the mystical and spiritual elements of Moses' community can be seen in the Pythagorean communities. The idea of an oral law, as nothing was written down by Pythagoras' followers, and the importance of gematria, mystical understandings to interpret what was written or previously understood about God and his creation. It's all there. And like the garden story, God wanted a place where he could live among his people. Centuries after the Garden of Eden story was told, Jewish prophets began to articulate visions of a restored paradise, not in the past, but in the future. They weren't just thinking wishfully. These were promises from God about how he would eventually set things right, and in many cases, they also mirrored what Moses had already set up, what Israel had already experienced with the first community. There's a story the rabbis tell about why it is that the 10 spies, 12 altogether, but the 10 that came back and denounced the land, they didn't do it because they were afraid. They did it because they didn't want to give up what they had in the desert. They knew that once they settled, things would change. They would have been wrong, but that's what they thought. So, interesting, in the desert, there was this utopian community. The prophet Isaiah, writing around 700 BCE, painted one of the most beautiful pictures of, of this future paradise. He wrote, quote, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them." Think about what Isaiah is describing here. Natural enemies, predators and prey living together in peace. And this isn't just about animals. It's a metaphor for all conflict being resolved. Nations that have been at war will live in harmony. People who have been enemies will become friends. The very nature of reality will be and has to be transformed. Isaiah continues, "They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." This is a vision of universal peace, universal knowledge of God, universal flourishing. No one will harm anyone else. Everyone will know God directly. The whole earth will be filled with the divine presence, it says, like the ocean is filled with water. Isaiah also prophesied about a future time when they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nations, neither shall they learn war anymore. Military weapons would be transformed into farming tools. The technology of death would become the technology of life. War itself would be forgotten. Another prophet, Ezekiel, had a different kind of vision, still molding into the same frame. Writing during the Babylonian exile when the Jewish people had been conquered and deported from their homeland, Ezekiel saw a vision of a restored Jerusalem with a magnificent new temple. We talked about that when we talked about the vision in our first podcast. But he saw this magnificent new temple at the center of the city. From this temple, a river would flow, bringing life wherever it went. Trees would grow along its banks, bearing fruit every month. Their leaves would be for healing. This wasn't just about rebuilding a destroyed city. It was about cosmic restoration. The temple represented God's presence dwelling among his people again. Remember that happened in the desert. The river represented life and blessing flowing out to the whole world. The ever-bearing trees represented abundance without end. Central to Jewish utopian thinking was the hope for a Messiah, an anointed king from the line of David, who would restore Israel and bring justice to the whole world. This wasn't just a political hope, and though it had political dimensions, it was a hope for complete transformation. The Messiah would be a perfect king, wise like Solomon, brave like David, just like Moses. He would defeat Israel's enemies, but more importantly, he would defeat evil itself, something that's never been done. He would establish God's kingdom on earth, a kingdom characterized by justice, peace, and righteousness. Different Jewish groups had different ideas about what the Messiah would do and when he would come, but the hope itself was and is constant. No matter how bad things got, conquest, exile, persecution, holocausts, the Jewish people held on to the belief that God would send a Redeemer who would make all things right. The Messianic hope is crucial for understanding utopian thinking. It represents a deep human longing, the belief that history is going somewhere, that suffering is not meaningless, that justice will ultimately prevail even when present circumstances seem hopeless. The future holds promise. As Jewish thought developed over the centuries, rabbis and scholars elaborated on the concept of Olam haba, the world to come. This wasn't exactly heaven in the Christian sense. It was a transformed version of this world, a perfected earth where God's will would be done completely. In the Talmud, the massive collection of Jewish law and wisdom compiled over centuries, rabbis debated about this world, what it would be like. Some said there would be no death. Others that people would still die but would be resurrected. Some said people would spend their time studying Torah, God's law, in perfect understanding. Others said that there would be great feasts and celebrations. The Midrash, a collection of Jewish stories and interpretations, contains beautiful descriptions of this future world. In one teaching, the rabbi said that in the world to come, the righteous would sit with crowns in their heads, basking in the radiance of God's presence. In another, they said that God himself would lead the righteous in a great dance. What's important here isn't the specific details, which varied widely, but the underlying conviction. This world is not all there is. History is moving towards a goal. God has a plan for ultimate redemption and restoration. It's not pie in the sky. It's not a vain hope. It's something that really will and can happen. How can it happen? We don't know, but before we're done with the podcast, I hope to give you some really concrete ideas. Jewish mystical tradition, particularly Kabbalah, developed the concept of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. And this is really a part of how this can and should come to pass. According to this teaching, when God created the world, divine light was placed in vessels. The vessels shattered, scattering sparks of divine light throughout creation. These sparks became trapped in the material world. in broken systems and human suffering. The task of humanity, according to this view, is to gather these sparks, to repair what's broken, to restore what's been damaged, to bring healing where there is hurt. Every act of justice, every deed of kindness, every moment of prayer helps to repair the world and bring it closer to its intended perfection. This idea transformed utopian thinking from passive waiting into active participation. This is key. You don't just wait for God to fix everything. You don't just wait for a Messiah. You partner with God in the work of redemption. You become a co-creator, a co-Messiah of the better world you're looking for. This concept had enormous influence even beyond Jewish circles. It suggests that utopian thinking isn't just imagining a perfect future. It's about taking responsibility for making the present better. Christianity emerged from Judaism and inherited many of its utopian themes, but with a crucial twist. Christians believed the Messiah had already come in the person of Jesus. The kingdom of God wasn't just a future hope, it had already begun, though not yet in its fullness. Jesus taught constantly about the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, but this kingdom was paradoxical. It was at hand, present, and available now. It was also still coming in the future. It was like a seed planted in the ground, already real, but not yet fully grown. In this kingdom, Jesus taught the last would be first, first would be last, the poor would be blessed, the meek would inherit the earth, those who mourned would be comforted. This was kind of an upside-down kingdom that challenged all conventional ideas about power and success, but it really does harken back to the ancient ideas of utopia. Early Christians lived with this tension between the already and the not yet. They believed Jesus had defeated sin and death through his resurrection. They believed the Holy Spirit had been poured out, giving them a foretaste of the age to come, but they also knew that suffering, injustice, and death still existed. They were living between two ages, and the only way that they could justify that was to make up a future time to come. The old age that was passing away, the new age that was breaking in, hadn't happened yet. The last book of the Christian Bible, Revelation, contains one of the most powerful utopian verses and visions in all of literature. The author John describes a vision of the end of history when God will create, quote, a new heaven and a new earth. In this vision, John sees a city in many ways like Ezekiel's, the New Jerusalem, descending from heaven to earth. The city is described in stunning detail: walls of jasper, gates of pearl, streets of gold, a river flowing through it. On either side the river grows the tree of life, bearing fruit and leaves for the healing of the nations. But the most important detail is this: God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, and neither shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Again, you can read all about this in Ezekiel's vision, in Isaiah's vision. There's nothing new here, really, other than the belief that the Messiah has already come. This is the ultimate utopian vision, not just a better society, but a completely transformed reality where suffering itself is abolished. God dwells directly with humanity. The separation caused by sin is healed. Hasn't been done yet, but it'll happen. Everything sad becomes happy. Notice something important. This isn't about humans building a perfect society through their own efforts. It's about God creating something new. The city descends from heaven. It's not built up from earth. This represents a different kind of utopian thinking, one that depends on divine intervention rather than human achievement. And in this, I suppose, is one of the main differences, although I think an argument can be made both ways. Judaism and the idea of Olam haba, the idea of Tikkun Olam, healing the world, this could be considered the biggest difference between what Christianity teaches and what Judaism teaches. It's that we have something to do. It's not all going to be done by God. There really, again, as I say, there's nothing new in the Christian version, even the new temple, much like Ezekiel's. But it's clear that the early Nazarenes understood that the mission of the Messiah was incomplete. And so they had to create the idea that he'd come back to complete it. So just like the Jews that gave them their vision, they too must wait for the Messiah and the utopia to follow. But also, like Judaism, they were not to stand idly by during this time of waiting, but actively work to bring heaven on earth now. Both groups understood, or at least initially, that this active waiting would require living in community. Let's jump forward now. Let's go to the year 1516. Europe is experiencing a renaissance, a rebirth of learning, art, culture. Ancient Greek and Roman texts are being rediscovered. New worlds are being explored. The printing press has made books available to more people than ever before. It's a time of tremendous change and possibility. In this context, an English lawyer and statesman named Sir Thomas More wrote a book that would give us the very word, utopia. The book was simply titled Utopia, and it described an imaginary island society that seemed to have solved all the problems plaguing European civilization. Now, More's Utopia is an island nation located somewhere in the New World, the Americas, which had recently been discovered by Europeans. The book is written as a dialogue, a conversation between More himself and a traveler named Raphael Hythloday, who claims to have visited this remarkable place. Let me describe what life is like on this island of Utopia, according to Hythloday's account. The island contains 54 cities, all built on the same plan. Each city surrounded by farmland, families taking turns living in the countryside to work in the land. This ensures that everyone understands where food comes from and that no one looks down on agricultural labor. In the cities, every street is 24 feet wide. Behind every house is a large garden. The Utopians took great pride in these gardens, competing to see who can grow the most beautiful flowers and the best vegetables. Houses aren't privately owned. Every 10 years, families switch houses by lottery. This prevents people from becoming too attached to property. Everyone in Utopia works, but no one works too much. The working day is only 6 hours long, 3 hours in the morning, then lunch, then 3 hours in the afternoon. This is possible because everyone works, unlike in Europe where nobles and clergy didn't do manual labor, and because Utopians didn't waste time producing luxury goods. So what do Utopians do with all of their free time? Well, they study, they read, they attend public lectures, they play music, they engage in conversation. That's when two people face-to-face talk to each other, for those that have forgotten what that is. The Utopians believe that the purpose of life is not to accumulate wealth, but to develop the mind and spirit. Again, no private property in Utopia. Everything is held in common. Every 10 years, the houses redistributed, meals taken communally in large dining halls, though families can eat at home if they prefer. When someone needs something, clothes, tools, food, they simply go to a warehouse and take what they need. There's no money, no buying, no selling. Why would this work? Why wouldn't people just take everything and hoard it? The Utopians have been raised from childhood to value the common good over private gain. They've been taught that greed is shameful, that true happiness comes from contributing to society, not from accumulating possessions. Also, since everyone's needs are met, there's no reason to hoard. We're going to look at this idea in terms of the argument, okay, it doesn't work. Because you're right, it doesn't work. By nature, within man now, is that desire to hoard, to accumulate, to be greedy. That's part of our nature, it would seem, but it doesn't have to be. And we'll talk about all of this later. So the Utopians, again, getting back to More, the Utopians are governed by elected officials. Each group of 30 families elects a leader, and these leaders elect the prince who governs the whole city. Officials can be removed if they abuse their power. Laws are few and simple, so simple that everyone can understand them without needing lawyers, which certainly in Moore's day and in ours could be considered a good thing. War is considered a terrible evil, but the utopians will fight to defend themselves or to help allies who have been unjustly attacked. And I want to clarify that statement before. It's not a bash on lawyers. It's a bash on a system that needs lawyers in order to work. All right, just to make that clear. People in Utopia, according to Moore, prefer to win through strategy and bribery rather than through bloodshed. People in the world tend to do this. They hire mercenaries and do most of their fighting, reasoning that it's better for professional soldiers to die than utopian citizens. Religion in Utopia is diverse. People worship different gods in different ways, but everyone believes in a supreme being and in the immortality of the soul. There is complete religious tolerance, again, a difficult concept. No one is persecuted for their beliefs. The utopians reason that if one religion is true, it will eventually win out through persuasion, not force, which makes sense. Hasn't worked so far, but makes sense. Now, here's what's fascinating about Moore's book. It's not entirely clear whether Moore actually thought Utopia was perfect or whether he was using it to just criticize European society. The name itself, Utopia, what does it mean? It's a pun in Greek. It can mean either a good place or no place, depending on how that one letter U, which is spelled with two letters in Greek, which two letters are used to spell that. It can mean, again, good place or no place. And the narrator's name, Hythloday, comes from Greek words meaning speaker of nonsense. All right, so you ask yourself, what was the purpose? Some aspects of utopian society seem genuinely admirable. The short working day, the emphasis on education, the lack of poverty, the religious tolerance, but other aspects seem troubling. The lack of privacy, the rigid regulation of life, the use of slaves. Yes, Utopia has slaves, criminals and prisoners of war who do the dirty work, but slaves nonetheless. Moore himself, of course, if you know anything about him, was a devout Catholic who would later be executed for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as head of the Church of England. He was no radical revolutionary, so what was he doing with his book? Perhaps he was holding up a mirror to European society, showing how irrational and unjust many of its practices were. If an imaginary pagan society could achieve peace, prosperity, and happiness through reason alone, what did that say about Christian Europe with all its wars, poverty, and corruption? Or perhaps he was exploring ideas, just testing them out in his imagination before committing to them in reality. This is one of the great values of utopian literature. It lets us experiment with different ways of organizing society without the real-world consequences. But this is also the problem with utopian writing, with utopian literature. The value is when, as Pythagoras did, the value is when you actually create that society and test what you're doing. But you have to be willing to accept the fact that there may be things that you would change, things that you would do different. And you also have to accept the fact that true utopia is not going to be here until the Messianic age. And we'll talk about all of that later. But I just want you to see the concept here is that it's important to explore these ideas, but it's more important to actually put them into practice, not worrying about whether or not it's going to work, because it will work. And I'll talk later about places like the kibbutzim and others that have done this. We saw again in the past Moses in the desert for 40 years and 300 years in Israel. We'll talk about that maybe in a little more detail. But the idea is these utopias have already existed. We have templates on how they can work. We can't be afraid to keep trying. because it's only when society sees it work, as More felt showing society by writing that they would learn, but that's not what would teach them. Anyway, More's work launched a whole genre of utopian literature for the next several centuries. Writers would imagine ideal societies often set on remote islands or distant planets. Books served multiple purposes. They entertained, they critiqued existing society, they inspired people to imagine alternative. But More's book also revealed a tension that would haunt all subsequent utopian thinking. The tension between individual freedom, social harmony. Utopia achieves peace and prosperity, but at the cost of privacy, diversity, individual choice. Everyone wears the same simple clothes. Everyone follows the same schedule. Everyone accepts the same basic values. But the question that comes out of all of this, is this a price that people are willing to pay? Can you have a perfect society without perfect conformity? And what about freedom? What about religious freedom? All of these things need to be addressed. About a century after More wrote Utopia, another English writer imagined a different kind of ideal society. Francis Bacon, another name you're probably familiar with, writing in 1627, described an island called Ben Salem in his unfinished book, New Atlantis. Bacon wasn't just a writer, he was one of the founders of modern science. He believed that knowledge was power, that systematic scientific investigation could improve human life. His utopia reflected his faith in science and technology. The most important institution in Ben Salem is the House of Solomon, also called Solomon's House or the College of the 6 Days Works. This is a scientific research institution, unlike anything that existed in Bacon's time. The House of Solomon is dedicated to discovering the true nature of things, extending human power over nature. It has vast laboratories, observatories, experimental facilities. Some of these facilities are built deep underground, others high on mountains to study different natural phenomena. The scientists of Solomon's House conduct experiments in every field imaginable. They have gardens where they make plants grow faster, produce new varieties. They have parks where they study animals, even create new species through selective breeding. Laboratories where they study heat, light, sound, motion. Rooms where they test new medicines and surgical techniques. But here's what's remarkable. The scientists don't work for personal gain or glory. They work for the benefit of all humanity. When they make a discovery, they carefully consider whether it should be shared with the public or kept secret. Some knowledge, they believe, is too dangerous to be widely known. So the House of Solomon is organized hierarchically. Some scientists travel to other countries in secret, gathering knowledge. Others conduct experiments. Others analyze results and draw conclusions. At the top of the interpreters of nature, their title, interpreters of nature, who use all of this accumulated knowledge to understand the fundamental laws governing reality. So again, you have that tiered system, but in this case, specifically, not just philosophers, but scientists are the ones who are in control. So Bacon's utopia different from More's in crucial ways, including what I just mentioned. More's utopia achieves perfection through social organization, through eliminating private property and organizing labor efficiently. Bacon's Ben Salem achieves perfection through knowledge, but specifically through physical knowledge, understanding and controlling nature. That idea of control is very important in Bacon's world. In Ben Salem, people still own private property. They're still rich and poor, though the gap between them not as extreme. What makes Ben Salem special is not its economic system, but it is its commitment to scientific progress. Bacon believed that humanity's problems, disease, hunger, poverty, could be solved through technology. If we understood nature well enough, we could bend it to our purposes. We would cure diseases, increase food production, create abundance for everyone. This was a revolutionary idea. For most of human history, people had assumed that the world was basically fixed and there would always be disease, hunger, scarcity. Bacon suggested that through science we could fundamentally change the human condition. So can you see how this idea now is evolving? It's coming into modern times, so now not just philosophy, but science is important. But the problem here, if you can really envision this, is that it throws out philosophy in favor of science, whereas in reality, there needs to be this blending, this coming together. So in today's time, you see stories of utopia. Oftentimes, unfortunately, it deals with dystopia, and we'll talk about that in the next podcast, where AI, artificial intelligence, is now going to be the one that controls these societies because they can do incredible things, just as science can do incredible things. Just as, and again, as this is emerging, we begin to see these visions grow and expand. And again, rather than just vilifying the whole idea of AI or the whole idea of science, we need to recognize how it works together in a true society where there's also God and man as partners. Anyway, Bacon's vision also raises troubling questions. Who decides which knowledge should be kept secret? What if the scientists at Solomon's house make mistakes or abuse their power? Is it really wise to try to control nature completely? These questions would become more urgent as science and technology advanced. In the 20th century, we would see both the tremendous benefits of scientific progress and indeed all of the things that Bacon envisioned for science should have happened. Why didn't it? Well, greed, I think, is probably key to understanding that answer. Bacon's utopia represents a faith in human reason and scientific method that would shape the modern world, but it also represents a kind of hubris, an overconfidence in our ability to control nature and predict the consequences of our action, and also to predict the need for greed. So what role do science and technology have in utopia, and how is it controlled? Let's look now around the same time as Bacon. An Italian philosopher, a Dominican friar named Tommaso Campanella, was imprisoned by the Spanish Inquisition for heresy and for allegedly plotting rebellion. During his imprisonment, which lasted 27 years, Campanella wrote The City of the Sun, describing yet another ideal society. Campanella's City of the Sun is built on a hill organized in 7 concentric circles, each named after one of the 7 planets known at that time. At the center, on the highest planet, stands a magnificent temple dedicated to the sun. The city is governed by a priest king called the Sun, or metaphysic, who is chosen for his wisdom and knowledge. He's assisted by 3 princes: Power, who oversees military affairs; Wisdom, who oversees education and the sciences; and Love, who oversees food production, clothing, procreation. Yep, you heard that right, procreation. In the City of the Sun, even reproduction is regulated for the good of society. And you see how we're moving now into more and more of the dystopia realms. Officials decide who should mate with whom based on physical and mental characteristics to produce the best possible children. This idea, which seems horrifying to us today, was Campanella's attempt to apply the principles of animal breeding to humans. Seemed logical. Like More's Utopia, the City of the Sun has no private property. This has always been very common to utopians. Everything is held in common. Officials distribute goods according to need. Citizens eat together in large dining halls, live in communal housing. Education is universal. It begins in early childhood. The walls of the city are covered with paintings and diagrams illustrating all branches of knowledge. again, making those accessible then to everyone. Mathematics, geometry, astronomy, botany, zoology, history. Children learn by walking through the city. An interesting idea. And studying visual aids. You don't need books. You've got the books all around you. Everyone learns a trade. No one specializes too narrowly. Citizens rotate through different jobs, spending time in agriculture, manufacturing, various crafts. This ensures that everyone appreciates all types of work, that no one becomes too attached to a particular role or status. Well, we'll get back to that. The working day is only 4 hours long, leaving plenty of time for study, exercise, recreation. The citizens of the City of the Sun are healthy, happy, and wise. They live in harmony with each other and with nature. So what makes Campanella's Utopia distinctive is its religious character. The City of the Sun is not just a well-organized society. It's kind of earthly paradise where people live in accordance with divine law. Now, what divine law regulates in this way has to be talked about, but Campanella believed that reason and revelation pointed in the same direction. A society organized according to rational principles would also be a society organized according to God's will. Science and religion, properly understood, could not conflict, and I would agree. This vision reflects Campanella's own complex position. He was a Catholic priest, but he was also influenced by Renaissance humanism and the new science. He wanted to reconcile faith and reason, tradition, and progress. Like other utopias, the City of the Sun achieves harmony through extensive control. Officials regulate not just economic life, but personal life. What you eat, what you live, or where you live, whom you marry, what children you have, how you raise your children. Individual desires are not important. And even if they're wise, is it right for them to make such intimate decisions for others is one of the problems. So let's finish this podcast by briefly looking at what all of these utopias had in common and what problems they addressed and what problems they created. Until the Renaissance, most utopias saw what? They saw a world without evil, without toil, struggle to live, a world in harmony with God or gods, and one that would willingly and joyfully follow the will of their creator leader. A strong emphasis on learning, education was the most important activity. All things were held in common. Knowledge and understanding were held sacred. Individual freedoms were intact, but they were less important than unity. But it was God who made that decision and not other men. All life was sacred, but only in the Jewish system was all life seen as equal. But essentially, all of the biblical prophecies regarding messianic times perfectly match every utopian vision for these times. For the source, you generally look to the oldest known writings that would be available, and that would be the Tanakh. Again, dating Moses at 1400. And you might argue about Sumerians. We'll talk about that because the 1400 date is really the time of Moses. He was writing and taking information from writing that existed before him. So an argument could be made even against the Sumerian writings. But at any rate, what came later was also very similar. But now we begin to see more class divisions, more human-centered structures, elected officials, everyone works, and there's more emphasis on possessions. And just prior to the Age of Enlightenment, more emphasis on science and technology. You also begin to find more inequality among the peoples. Some have greater freedoms than others. Freedom itself is seen as something dangerous, and so there's a need for stronger controls put in place. The three key elements of utopia seem to include education, social organization, and personal development. But within all of that, there's this variety. But notice how it began one way. And then as time and problems developed, it changed. I argue if we go back to some of the earlier ideas, the ideas of Moses, that we have a clear understanding of what a community should be based on. But we can see in all of the ideas of community things that we can emulate, things that we can learn from. So what of our questions? Who decides which knowledge should be kept secret? What if the leaders abuse their power? Are we meant to dominate or control nature completely? Is utopia a price worth paying? Can you have a perfect society without perfect conformity? And what about religious freedom or the tension between individual freedoms and social harmony? Utopia achieves peace and prosperity, but is it at the cost of privacy, diversity, individual choice? How is it possible for all humans to get along? And how does Santa Claus deliver presents around the world in 1 or 2 nights? Okay, so the last might not be an issue of utopia, but it's the idea that these are questions that don't always have clear answers, but it doesn't mean that you stop believing in the principles involved there. So the 20th century has seen a continuation of the battle between reason and romanticism, rationalism and mysticism. With little conflict, Darwin and Freud coexist in the modern mind. Marx exhibited the split vision, extolling the power of practical, realistic workers who would create a utopian world. In fact, this dichotomy, which began in the Renaissance and became a gaping wound in the 17th and 18th centuries as we embrace science and reason as our God, has allowed for 20th century aberrations like Hitler and his Aryan Übermenschen, or Stalin and his totalitarian state. Clearly, the 20th century mind is in dire need of healing and reinventing a healthy vision of humans in the world, one which integrates both the rational bent and the mystic bent of every human mind, will affect that healing. What the utopian dreamers of old failed to see is that you cannot bring about a change only of the head if you haven't developed a comprehensive plan to treat the diseased body. We cannot return to the garden when we hide in fear from the God within and the God without, who asks us where we are, and we cannot answer. We cannot return to the garden when we blame others for our own problems. We cannot return to the garden with our guilt and pride because we think we know what is good and what is evil, and that turns us into judges of ourselves and others. We cannot return to the garden with our intellect, but with our voices as we communicate with one another and live in relationship so that we are indeed our brother's keeper. How do we do this? We're going to look at this later. We're going to take a look at some ideas about all of this. But the main thing now is to accept at least the idea that this is important. So in our next podcast, we'll move closer to our present times and explore dystopian literature, as well as also Martin Buber and the kibbutz movement, which will also have their own podcast, but we'll give you at least an introduction in the next one. And we'll draw some conclusions and try to answer our questions, or at least create some answers to the questions, resolve to some degree the problems. So please stay tuned for the next exciting episode of It Takes a Village to Bring Mashiach. I'm Tom Averna. Shalom.